Hello, my name is Kevin Murdoch. I'm the mayor of the District of Oak Bay, and I'm just speaking with you today about legislative changes, I think well-intentioned legislative changes to address housing happening at the provincial government, but that have the very real risk of eroding our democratic structures in a way that I think has some potential very negative long-term impacts. And I preface this by acknowledging that democracies are amazing, but they're fragile, and they take a lot of work to keep going. Democracies require the trust of the people that we serve, and we build and structure our organizations in a way to earn and keep that trust. Things like accountability, transparency, rule of law. Without that trust, we just can't survive. And I see these threatened with the new legislation. We do tend to take democracy for granted. It seems easy when you're in it, but it's not. We look at the Remembrance Day that just happened and our forebears who fought and died for the values and principles and the life that we have here. We can't let this go without at least recognizing the impact that this is happening. And the structures that we have really do strengthen or weakness our democracy. And I say this as well, I love local government. I think it's really an exemplary model for democracy. It was set up through the provincial government legislation in a way that is almost an idealized version of democracy, but it's done for specific reasons, and it's lasted for decades in very high functioning fashion for that reason. We're closest to the people that we serve. We're nonpartisan. We're transparent. I just want to give a few examples. I think people don't necessarily understand how municipal government differs from our provincial and federal counterparts. For instance, the public is able to view all of the same information and advice provided to council at the same time that we receive it. So when our agendas come out, all the correspondence, all the staff reports, all the information is equally shared with both the public and the council. We are the same. Nothing happens behind closed doors. Our meetings are all open to the public. We can't run deficits, so all of our accounting has to meet with generally accepted accounting principles and is reported annually and is therefore tied to our priorities and accountability. We have public input on almost all of our agenda items, and in fact, the public can even come and speak to us about issues that aren't even on the agenda but are of public interest. We are required to have equitable access and input from the public on matters. So, in fact, there's been court cases that have thrown out decisions that have been made when a public hearing didn't allow for everybody to be fully heard from. So these are embedded in the structures that we have. And I think the last but definitely not least is the fact that we are all at a council table obligated to have an open mind. So we have to come to the council table listening, ready to listen, and that really tends to lead to a more consensus or at least compromise-driven decision-making. And this actually makes a lot of sense when you look at what we do. Most of our decisions are land use type decisions or supportive of that. So they typically have at least a 60 or often 80, 90, or even 100-year longer impacts. And when you're making those kind of decisions, it's really important to have all of the information possible available to you, all of the facts, so that when you're making that decision, you're making it with eyes wide open of the pros, the cons, the risks, the opportunities. It ensures that all of the decisions are being made on the same information. So we're not having 7 people with 7 different information sources. We all have the same information, and it prevents that secret influence that can happen. And it ensures clear delineation between professional staff advice, advisory bodies that might have a linear, specific knowledge base, the public, which may have a historical or more localized knowledge, and then, of course, council themselves, which have to take all of those sources of information and make decisions and be held accountable. So it's a very robust and intentionally designed, through provincial legislation, model of democracy. And it's being eroded. So just 1 year ago, there was an election at the municipal level. 161 municipalities, councillors, mayors went out and talked to their communities, developed priorities and policies, and were elected to enact that vision for their communities. Those votes lose much of their value with this new legislation. The visions and the priorities that were put forward by those councils are essentially being set aside as public hearings are forbidden, and the decisions that we want in terms of priorities are being pushed aside behind the provincial priorities. And I do note that history teaches us, this is always seems legitimate at the time. Oh, there's a crisis. We have to speed things up. But this is when rollbacks of democratic principles happen, and I think we have to be on the guard on the lookout for it. And I believe this is one of those moments, the inflections in time, where we have to say, no, this is not the right, what we're losing is not worth what we're gaining. Because housing is a crisis, no doubt, but so is climate change, so is the overdose epidemic, so is the healthcare crisis, and more. And while democratic approaches can slow these changes, I disagree that an entire level of government should be so gutted in the name of a crisis response. And in this case, particularly when local governments have actually been really proactive, positive partners. We've been seeking provincial assistance to address the housing crisis. So what's happened? Over the last 2 weeks, the province has enacted a series of legislative changes that require changes to zoning and oversight, which strips powers from local government and really lets the development community have the primary say in the future community. We've even moved from requiring public input and having words around that effect, essentially banning it until all of these changes are enacted. It unfortunately also downloads an enormous amount of cost as all of these changes are being passed on to the local governments to enact, all of which take work and time that we're going to set aside other priorities. It is a blanket, very cookie-cutter approach, tackling all municipalities to increase all densities by 4 to 6 times what it is right now. But most critically, no input is allowed on these changes until after they've been enacted.